In 1999, I moved back to Washington State from traveling around the country for 4 years. My grandmother let me move in with her for a while so I could get back on my feet again. I hated the basement of her house, always have, but it was rent-free, and she was cool with Chuck, my 90-pound black lab plus. My grandma and I got along pretty well. Late one night, about 3 months in, I woke up because Chuck was moving around on the bed, and he kept shaking the mattress. Then, I heard him start grumbling. You know, those grumpy growls old dogs make when you scratch behind their ears, and they love it. You started doing that. Once I realized what I was hearing, I sat up to yell at him to go back to sleep. That's when I discovered the reason he was moving around so much. He was trying to get closer to the woman standing right next to my bed, scratching him behind the ear. I didn't scream, and I'm proud of that. But also, what in God's name? Where did she come from? Who was she? Why was she standing in my room, petting my dog at 3 a.m.? All these questions I had in my head, I was too scared to ask. I did the only thing I knew how to do in these situations. I hid under my blanket. Certainly, she would be gone by the time I re-emerged from under the blanket. That's how these things are supposed to work, right? I waited for a little while, but when I came out from under the blanket, she was still there. So I hid under the blanket again, 3 more times. Every time I came back out, she'd still be there, smiling at me and scratching my dog's ear. The last time I was under the cover is when I realized that I wasn't actually afraid of the woman. Chuck and I met under stressful situations for both of us, and because of that, he and I had a super strong bond. I trusted him implicitly. If she'd meant me harm, he would have reacted to her negatively. His reaction was clearly positive, so I figured that she probably wasn't there to kill me. So I came out from under the blanket one last time, intending to deal with the freaky woman still standing right next to my bed. Somehow I decided that turning on the light would make her disappear. I reached over and snapped the bedside lamp on. I don't know why I thought that would work. Is that even a thing? Are ghosts supposed to disappear in the light? Well, I turned on the lights, and she didn't. So I don't think that's a thing. But then she'd been standing in my bedside petting Chuck for several minutes, and I was out of ghost-busting options. So I gave up on being terrified and just looked at her, really looked at her. I can still see her right now in my mind, dressed up in a classy brown pantsuit with a cream-colored blouse. She had shoulder-length auburn hair styled beautifully with these big loopy curls. She looked like she'd been on her way to a work party and had only stopped by for a second to say hello. She was very pretty and she looked happy. I didn't have the nerve to talk to her, at least I don't remember speaking, but I stayed present and we looked at each other for a while. I remember having the distinct impression of her knowing I was there, of both of us being aware of the other. Then she stopped petting Chuck and walked to the end of my bed, stood up straight and proud, and dissolved away. I mean that very literally, burst her clothes, and then her skin, organs, and bones, like that guy at the end of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Arkansas. I remember what her blood looked like as it dissolved away to reveal her skeleton. That should be a gross and terrifying memory, but I don't remember it like that. At the time, it felt like she was doing it on purpose, like she wanted to leave with the most dramatic exit she could manage. I remember thinking, this should scare the pants off of me, but also, wow. Somehow, I got back to sleep, and in the morning, over coffee, I was going to tell my grandmother about what happened. but she just received an upsetting phone call. Apparently, her best friend from high school, Ursula, had passed away in the middle of the night. I'd heard stories about their teenage shenanigans, especially the one about the stolen birthday cake, but I never saw a picture of Ursula. So I asked what she looked like. Well, I couldn't tell you what she looked like these days, but when we were young, she had the most beautiful curly auburn hair. It's not the only weird thing that happened in my grandmother's basement, but it remains the most vivid and the least scary. Many of us encounter someone who just grabs our attention in a way that we can't explain, like they know you from this or a previous life. I come from a long line of people who encountered ghosts. But I myself don't encounter the supernatural that much. I have in the past, but not often. Tonight, I know I did. This is not fake or made up. Our town is near a beach, and every 4th of July, we go see the fireworks over the water. This year was no exception. My wife and I arrived and set up chairs, settled in the sand, and chilled out, waiting for darkness to fall and the fireworks to start. A slight breeze, a perfect, beautiful evening. About 20 minutes after we settled, I smelled a waft of what I can only describe as decayed roses on the breeze, like flowers in a vase that should have been thrown out a few days ago. It wasn't a bad smell, but just like sweet roses that weren't fresh. Then I saw her from behind. Walked a young woman in jean shorts, t-shirt, and a ball cap. She looked about 25 and had light brown wavy hair coming down about halfway on her back. I was immediately struck by her presence, not because she was beautiful. I mean, she wasn't ugly. She was pretty, and she looked a bit off, though her face, especially, looked pretty but weird, I suppose. Like her features didn't line up right or something. She stopped about 15 feet ahead of us, turned around, looked right at me, smiled, and sat down in the sand. Again, she really did look off. Something was amiss, but I was enchanted by this young woman. I looked at my wife to see what she thought, but got zero reaction, like she didn't even see her. I smelled the decayed roses on the wind again. This young woman in jean shorts and a ball cap sat down, took off her flip-flops, and looked to the sky. She was sitting perpendicular to us, but facing away. When I thought about it more, two things struck me as very, very odd. She had no electronics, no cell phone. Everyone on the beach was taking selfies and playing with their phones, even the elderly. This young woman had no visible phone, no electronics. Also, her clothes looked straight out of the 1970s. I grew up in the 1970s, so I know what normal people looked like back then. And she had that 70s look totally down to the tomboy jeans and really just everything about her. She seemed very content just sitting there, looking at the sky, and not worried about cell phones or beach chairs or anything. Again, I smelled sweet decaying roses on the wind. I took a picture of the whole scene on my cell phone, the pretty sky, the beach, and the strange woman. Shortly after, she got up and walked away behind us. I looked around to see where she went, but she disappeared. She was gone. When I got home and looked at the picture, I actually was not surprised to see she didn't appear in it. You might think I would have freaked out, but on some spiritual level, I really didn't expect her image to show up. Just a green orb appeared where she was sitting in the sand. I'm calm about it because I could tell she meant no harm. I really believe she was a person who passed away back in the 70s, and she was just checking in on me for some reason. I'm racking my brain to try and remember if I knew a young woman who passed away when I was a child back then. I just can't put it together right now. So, people can be very weird. We can even affect people that we never even notice. It just blows my mind, some of the thoughts that run through other people's minds. And I'll tell you my story, and you'll know what I mean. At the time, I was working a ton. I was saving money to buy my girlfriend a ring, and spoiler alert, we're married now. We were renting a small house, but still better than the apartment because at least we weren't sharing walls. I was also saving money so we could buy a house. She was also saving money for the same reason. Since I was working so much, she decided to volunteer for a 5-day retreat with the company she worked for. She would get paid a ton of overtime, and this allowed me to work overtime at my job even more than I already was doing. I was going to miss her, but it seemed like a great opportunity to bring home some extra cash, especially with the holidays rapidly approaching. At the time, on Wednesday when I left for work, I noticed a weird smell in my car. Not a bad smell, just a very strange one. It was sort of like a perfume, but one that a younger girl would wear. Some thoughts crossed my mind, but I eventually just chalked it up to some weirdness that I didn't understand, and honestly, I didn't care much either. It was just small, after all. That night, I had a horrible time sleeping. I told myself it was most likely because I missed my girlfriend. I was always used to her being there, and now this was the 3rd night in a row that I was sleeping alone. I swore that I could hear noises all night long coming from downstairs, but it wasn't loud enough or scary enough to raise any alarm bells. So, again, I ignored the weird signs and told myself that it was probably just house noises or the wind. Thursday morning arrived, and I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I made my coffee and hoped that it would do the trick. Soon, when I got to the car, I found it unlocked. I'm good about locking the car door, but I had been working a lot, and the thought of forgetting to lock the door was on my mind. Ignoring the unlocked door, I got into the car and started to drive to work. Now, same story as the previous day. I could smell that perfume again, and now some red flags were raising. But I couldn't even begin to think about what could possibly be going on. Every thought I had ended with me blaming it on myself for being overtired or missing my girlfriend. It was the most logical explanation, at least to me at the time. I left work that evening, and once again, the smell in my car was clearly perfume. I even had a coworker come over and smell my car just to make sure that I wasn't being delusional. He said that he could clearly smell it too. It was probably just my girlfriend's perfume, and because I missed her, I'm starting to subconsciously notice certain smells that I may have gone nose blind to. I knew the smell of her perfume, and I knew that wasn't it. But what he said seemed kind of logical, and I just assumed he was correct. Maybe my senses of smell were changing. And when I got home again, all I could smell was that perfume, and now I was really weirded out. I kept trying to convince myself that my coworker was correct, but it wasn't working. I decided to take a shower and go grab some food and a drink at the bar just to unwind. My girlfriend was coming home the next afternoon, and it was also my first day off in 13 days, so I was ready to relax. I got home late that Thursday night, maybe around midnight, and got myself ready for bed. That smell hit me as soon as I opened the door to the house. I was more annoyed at this point than anything else. I was never scared. It was just so weird that it bothered me. I got into bed not long after getting home and started to fall asleep. I knew that she was coming home tomorrow, so I was hoping all the weird smells would go away. I must have fallen asleep for a little while because I was awoken by someone getting into the other side of the bed. For a second, I thought it was my girlfriend. I was half asleep, and my mind just went right to her as she was getting into bed. She shushed me, and I turned back around. She started to cuddle up to me like she was the big spoon, which she had never done before. But I was so tired and so happy that she was home that I didn't even care. Maybe a minute later, my eyes shot open. I looked down, and a woman's forearm was lying across my body, holding me. I smelled the arm, and I instantly recognized the perfume. This was not my girlfriend. Then I started to come to my senses, and I remembered that she wasn't coming home until the afternoon. Why would she have come home in the middle of the night? I jumped out of bed, freaking out. I turned the lights on, and just sitting in my bed was some young girl, probably in her mid-20s. She was smiling and kept brushing her hair away from her face. She kept asking me what was wrong and calling me babe. I was screaming for her to get out of my bed, but she just kept smiling. I called the police, but she didn't even react. She started to shush me again, and she kept trying to rub my arm the entire time. I was freaking out and telling her that the cops were coming, but she didn't seem to care. She didn't look crazy or anything. She looked like a pretty normal girl. She was also dressed in a very small and low-cut piece of nightwear, and when she got out of bed to try and console me, she put on a low-cut fluffy robe. The cops showed up, and I immediately went to them, pleading my case, and the woman just sat there, letting me do this. She wasn't armed, she hadn't tried to hurt me, and there had been no issues with the law prior or anything. I later heard she was just some girl. The cops took her out, and she said in some weird, calm voice to me that she loves me, saying that she'll be back and that this is just a misunderstanding. My heart was going 100 beats a second. After some investigating, it turns out this woman was our neighbor on the street we lived on. She was a quiet girl, so quiet that I didn't even know that she existed on the same street. And while she lived at this house, she developed some obsession, sort of an infatuation with me. When she noticed my girlfriend hadn't been around for a few days, she started to break in, and the poor girl convinced herself that I was in love with her. Through all of this, she was never dangerous, and thankfully, that was the case because who knows what would have happened if she actually meant me harm. But even though the woman meant no harm, it doesn't make the situation any less creepy. I had a borderline stalker living in my house for almost a week, and she got into my bed with me. She never returned to her house, and we moved shortly after that. Anyway, from what I understand, she had family, and the family was notified, and last I knew, she was being treated for some type of illness. I'm not sure what it was. So, forgive my ignorance, but now do you know what I mean when I say people are weird? You just truly never know what could happen. I'm a 30-year-old female and had just woken up. I was getting ready for the day in her bathroom, which was attached to our bedroom. If you look through the door, you have a full view of our bed and my sleeping 5-year-old son. I saw something adult-sized move past the door in the dark bedroom at regular walking speed. So I opened the door a bit and looked out. There was no one there, and my kid was snoring. My husband should have been at work for 2 hours by this point. I checked our security cameras and saw nothing but my husband leaving for work earlier. I chalked it up to my anxiety and sleep deprivation, as I'm heavily pregnant and can't sleep for anything right now. A few minutes later, I heard what sounded like an adult man humming, but it only lasted a few seconds. I can't name the tune, though. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, as we slept with the box fan on full blast right outside the door, and I had the exhaust fan on at the time. I looked out of the bathroom door again, and there was nothing. Am I going crazy? I thought. I took a deep breath and continued to wash my face. The door was open about 2 to 3 inches. In the mirror in our tiny bathroom, there is one that covers most of the wall from the counter to almost the ceiling. It's big, and you can see everything behind you and around you. The door's to my left, right behind me. You could reach it and tap my shoulder. Out of the corner of my eye through the mirror, I suddenly saw something that wasn't there before. There was a hand reaching through the opening of the door, gripping the door frame right behind me. It looked like a grown man's hand and was at eye level. I froze, then turned around, half expecting my husband to be playing a prank because who else would be in here with me? The hand was gone. I even checked through the mirror. Instantly, my child screamed, "Mama," as loud as they could, and I jerked the door open. There was nothing there but a scared kid with wide open eyes. He wasn't looking at me. "Who is that, Mama?" I was trying not to sound scared. They stared off into space for a few seconds, then seemingly forgot about whatever just happened. "Mama, why did you say my name?" "I didn't, baby." "Did you hear your name?" "You said my name real loud, and then you weren't beside me." "I was in the bathroom." "I don't think I did, buddy." "It sounded like you." I checked the cameras. I checked the windows and doors, every room and closet, shaking the whole time. Nothing. I feel safer living in this apartment than I ever have anywhere else, even alone, and I have bad anxiety. Like I said, if it was only one of us, I would have shrugged it off as sleep deprivation or night terrors, which my kid has never had, or something rational. But I'm asking all of you, what did we see in here? So, where I live in London, there's this outdoor exercise park I like to frequent as part of my workout routine. I'm sure most of you know the kind I'm talking about, the kind that's paid for with public money and is mostly just painted metal frames consisting of pull-up bars and the like. Between that exercise park and the free weights I have at home, I think I've saved myself a few £100 in gym membership fees. I used to love the place, and it provided a real sense of community. That might sound crazy coming from a Londoner, but the stereotype of us all being cold and aloof with each other is a bit of a myth, to be honest. But I hadn't even been near that little corner of Kensington in almost 2 years now, and honestly, I don't want to lay eyes on that place ever again. And I'll tell you why. So, I'm hanging off one of the pull-up bars one day, trying to get that one extra rep on my set when I hear what I can only describe as a blood-curdling scream. I know that might sound sort of melodramatic, but those of you who have heard the scream of a person who's actually in fear for their life will know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a sound that elicits a physical reaction in you. Your brain takes over and says, "Time to go," pumps you full of adrenaline, and triggers that fight or flight response that I know a lot of you will be familiar with. In my case, I was feeling a little bolder than usual, thanks to testosterone. So, I made the split-second decision to run towards the sound of the screaming. I jogged out of the park in the direction I'd heard the scream, just in time to see two people sprinting in the same direction. It was quite obvious a smaller woman being chased by a larger man. With it being later on at night and in the middle of lockdown, I figured that no one else would be coming to help her. It was down to me and me alone, so I ran. I sprinted after the pair of them, shouting something to the effect of, "Oi, leave her alone." The chaser was wearing a hoodie and a baseball cap, and I remember the silhouette of him clear as he looked around for a moment. Saw me, then carried on chasing the girl. I remember that scaring the bejesus out of me, thinking that he didn't care if he'd been clocked or not. He was going to keep chasing that girl, didn't care if there were witnesses. I was honestly hoping that just me intervening would scare him off. So, the prospect of dealing with such a psycho who was undeterred by imminent intervention, Christ, that put the fear of God into me. But what else could I do? Just turn around and walk away? I wouldn't have been able to live with myself. So, like I said, I ran after them. As I ran, I watched them turn down a dead-end street. I'm not sure if either of them knew it was a dead end, but I did. So, as I followed them down, I knew that whatever confrontation was about to occur, it was going to happen right then. But as I turned the corner and got ready to bark my head off while kicking the guy's head in, I was greeted with the single most confusing and unnerving sight of my adult life. There was no one there. The only thing I could see was this dead-end street, some overflowing wheelie bins at the end of it, and some creepy-looking black street art depicting two human shapes. They were just shapes, no faces, no clothes, the kind of thing a kid would have just sprayed there in about 10 seconds. They were just stood there, still as statues, like they were staring right back at me. I never had a panic attack before, and I didn't even know what one felt like. So, the fact that my vision went all cloudy and I suddenly found it hard to breathe, it was terrifying. It was only when I calmed down a bit and I thought to actually call the police. I mean, just because I'd lost them didn't mean it hadn't been happening or whatever. So, I called 999, told the operator what I'd seen, and then went back to my flat to get a shower and some food. I thought I might calm down after that. I mean, you can understand why I've been shaken up after something like that, right? I'd left my details with the police dispatcher, as I obviously wanted to be of more help if I could. They did actually end up phoning me back, too. At least a uniformed officer called me back. But it wasn't to collect a statement or to ask me any more questions. I won't bore you with the nitty-gritty of the phone call. I'd rather not rehash every word, and I'm sure you'll understand why. The officer started off by confirming a few details: location, number of people being chased, number of people chasing, and that sort of thing. It all sounded totally routine at first, but then things took a more sinister turn. I was basically told in no uncertain terms that wasting police time was seen as a very serious offense. Not only that, but I was basically threatened with violating the newly instituted Coronavirus Act of 2020. I responded by telling the officer I was 100% serious about what I'd seen, that I wasn't wasting their time, and that I'd been partaking in my allotted daily exercise time. In response, the officer basically told me to pull the other one. He told me that he and a colleague had reviewed some CCTV footage from the area, footage which showed nothing more than a lone man running down a street before turning a blind corner. Basically, they told me I'd been chasing nothing but shadows. If I made another false report like that, he personally would make sure I was charged for both wasting police time and violating the COVID Act. I was speechless, and after the officer told me that I was entitled to make a complaint about it in the snarkiest way possible, he hung up. I was in a state of complete shock. It all seemed like a sick joke, one that I definitely didn't find amusing. I remember sitting down on my bed on the verge of another panic attack. Only that time, I'd actually found out what they were and I knew how to deal with them. I wrapped a plastic bag around my mouth and nose and cycled my air until I felt kind of a woozy calm descend over me. Then, once I felt relatively normal, I called my mum back in Sheffield. I know it sounds a bit pathetic, a bloke in his early 30s running to mummy when he was upset, but I honestly didn't know who else to turn to at that point. I felt like I was going insane. I told her everything, absolutely everything, down to the last detail. And when it was done, Mom said something that had me on the verge of tears. I remember what it was word for word, and I don't think I'll ever forget. "Dean, I'm your mom. I love you, and I'll always love you, son. I think you need to get some help." She launched into this big speech about how lockdown and self-isolation had really taken their toll on people over the previous few months, and that maybe I was just having some kind of stress reaction to the whole pandemic thing. This was late spring of 2022, back when people were really scared. Not just vulnerable people or those with vulnerable relatives. I mean, everyone was really freaked out by this killer disease that had seemingly sprung up from nowhere. I'd already admitted to having panic attacks. Well, only one, but one was enough to have my mom really thinking that there was something wrong. I knew she was concerned, but she told me as much. But I didn't expect her to do what she did next, even if it was purely out of love and concern. A few days later, I got a call from a doctor, and almost instantly, I knew what the deal was. It was a psychiatrist, and to his credit, he was completely honest about his reasons for calling. They said it wasn't an emergency, just that my mom had been in contact with him, and would I be interested in having a few over-the-phone counseling sessions to help with the stress of social distancing. It brought on mixed emotions. On one hand, my mom was so concerned with my well-being that she'd sought out medical health assistance for me, and it was purely an act of motherly love. But on the other hand, the one person I needed to believe me thought I was going bonkers, so much so that she contacted someone who could actually contribute to me being sectioned under the Mental Health Act. There was only one thing that I was sure of in that moment, and that was that I hadn't imagined anything. Like I said, I had a physical reaction to that scream. I'd seen the guy chasing the girl. I could remember the sound her hard-bottom shoes made as they hit the pavement. I could remember the sight of the guy's baseball cap head spinning to clock me before I gave chase. I hadn't bloody imagined anything. It was real. It was all real. But then again, I was now faced with something of a dilemma. Either I keep talking about how I'd apparently chased two pieces of street art down an alleyway and face getting sectioned, or just admit that it was all just a manifestation of stress and take a prescription of Zopiclone or whatever it was the doctor wanted to give me. On the one hand, I wanted to fight my corner. I hadn't lied, and I wasn't going crazy. But on the other, I didn't want to worry my mom any further, and I didn't want to lose my job. The company I worked for basically said that anyone who couldn't work from home was surplus to requirements and would have their weekly hours reduced to 0. So, I did what I thought was best for my mom and what was best for me in the long run. I rang the doctor back, told them I was just stressed out, and accepted the recommendation of a Zopiclone prescription. At this point, I should make it clear that Zopiclone is pretty much just a sleep aid. There are no antipsychotic effects, none that were obvious to me, anyways. I took one of the pills one night, and after that, I never touched the pack again. After that, I just learned to let the whole thing go. I know that all sounds preposterous, given how indignant I might have seemed in writing this, but sometimes, I'm sure some of you will be able to relate to this. Sometimes it's better to take what's called the path of least resistance. Some people want a resolution, a grand conclusion to be able to draw a line under an experience and say, that's that, done and dusted, or I understand now, I get it. But there's a lot to be said for the power of just forgetting about something. I know that seems rich coming from me, typing up some big essay after almost 2 years of trying to forget. But trust me, it's something I wish every single day that I could do. I feel like a moth dancing around a burning candle, wanting nothing more for the flame to be suddenly and finally extinguished. I was 8 years old when we first moved into the house on the edge of the forest. My parents had their doubts about buying a house with a backyard bordered by a forest. They had concerns about the wild animals getting into our bins or hurting our dogs, and we were worried one of us might go too far into the trees and get lost. But it was cheap. My dad liked the seclusion, my mom loved the house itself, and my siblings and I were excited about playing in the backyard and exploring the forest. Our first sign that something wasn't right was that our dogs were absolutely terrified of the forest. They never went into the forest for any reason. If a toy they'd been playing with found its way past the tree line, they would refuse to retrieve it. And when one of us went in, they would pace anxiously until we returned. On occasion, we'd notice the dogs staring at a spot in the forest in obvious distress, sometimes growling or barking. But we could never see anything there. My brother once carried one of the dogs into the trees to show her there was nothing scary about it, but she wriggled out of his grip and sprinted into the house in a panic. If we were in the backyard when it was getting dark, we sometimes heard noises like someone walking through the forest, sticks crunching underfoot, branches being pushed aside. If we called out, there was no response. But if we shined a flashlight around, we would occasionally catch a glimpse, for just a split second, of something that we could swear looked like a person walking around in the dark. My parents quickly banned us from entering the forest, and after dark, and even during the day, we weren't allowed to go outside of the house. My sister's bedroom window looked down to the backyard and the forest beyond, and she remembers looking out her window one night and seeing a shadowy figure standing right at the edge of the backyard. She said there was something wrong with it, like it wasn't quite standing on the ground and it was a little too tall to be a person, and was sort of distorted. She was convinced it was staring directly at her. She called for our dad, saying that there was a man in the yard, staring through her window. And when he ran outside to chase off whoever it was, she continued to watch the figure. It didn't move away, but when the light from our dad's flashlight passed over it, it suddenly just wasn't there anymore. We regularly heard knocking at the back door at night with no one there. My parents thought it was teenagers playing pranks and stopped bothering even opening the door, until one rainy night when the knocking was persistent and agitated. My mom pointed out there might be someone needing shelter from the heavy rain outside. But when she opened the door, not only was there no one there, but there were no wood footprints on the porch. The knocking continued the whole time we lived there. It would happen several times in the span of a few weeks, then stop for months, then start up again. My parents eventually installed a security camera, but there was never anyone at the door. The camera wasn't all useless though. About 3 years into living there, my brother started having night terrors and sleepwalking. When he went sleepwalking, he would always go out the back door and start walking towards the forest. My mom, being a light sleeper, would hear the door open and would run out to get him before he made it into the forest. After the third or fourth time it happened, my brother asked to see the camera footage because he wanted to see how he looked when sleepwalking, I guess thinking it'd look funny. The footage showed him walking out on the porch, then pausing as if listening to something, and shaking his head, then reluctantly walking forward, as if being pulled or forcefully guided by something. One evening, my dad was in the backyard, and he heard my sister calling him from the forest, seemingly in distress. Thinking she had gone exploring in the forest and fallen over and hurt herself, he ran in and started calling to her. But he quickly realized it was too dark to see her, and he couldn't pinpoint where her voice was coming from. He told her to wait where she was while he grabbed a flashlight. When he ran back inside the house for the flashlight, he saw my sister inside, safe and completely unconcerned. At the time, my dad hadn't told us about hearing my sister's voice in the forest. So when I heard my mom's voice coming from the forest months later while I was outside with the dogs one evening, I didn't question it, despite the fact that I'd seen my mom inside recently and hadn't noticed her walking past me. My mom was calling to me, saying she got her sweater caught in some branches and needed me to come and help her. As I walked in, the dogs started barking, alerting my dad, who saw me through the windows wandering into the forest. He came outside and called to me, and I said I was just helping Mom. He yelled back that Mom was inside and I needed to run back to the house as fast as I could, which I did. After this, my parents had a fence built around the backyard and started looking for a new place. In the time between the fence being built and us moving out, it got way worse. We'd hear knocking at the door more regularly, as well as tapping on the windows, as if someone was walking the perimeter of the house and trying every window. We would often hear scratching and scraping sounds on the fence and voices beyond it. My brother's night terrors got more frequent, and one night, my mom didn't hear the door open when he went sleepwalking, and he woke up standing at the fence, staring into the forest with the dogs barking at him. The last morning we spent there, less than 4 years after we moved in, we woke up to find the back door fully open. The security camera footage showed it slowly swinging open on its own. Since moving out, my brother's sleepwalking has stopped, though he still gets night terrors and suffers from pretty severe anxiety. A few nights ago, he called me out of the blue, and after a bit of small talk, he asked me if I think the door being open that final night means whatever was out there finally got in. He was trying to make light of it, saying he was getting into the spirit of Halloween, joking about how maybe we should all get exercise just in case something latched onto us all those years ago. But I think he's deeply bothered by everything that happened. I know I still am a little. I still get nervous around dark wooded areas. I don't know what I think was out there in the forest behind our house at night, but I get the feeling that given the chance, it would have swallowed us whole. We've all had traumatic things happen to us in life. Some are much more serious than others. When I was in high school, something traumatic and horrifying happened to me. I stayed overnight at one of my buddies' houses. His parents were going out of town on Saturday night to celebrate their anniversary. He invited me over to just kind of kick it and hang out for the night so he wasn't alone. We did invite a few people over, played some games, but ultimately everyone left around 11 or so. He and I hung out for a little while longer, but then decided to lie down at around 2 o'clock in the morning. We were dozing off, watching The Office, when we heard a loud bang downstairs. I thought it sounded like it was the door, but my friend said that he thought it was a neighbor and just to ignore it. He was pretty tired at that moment, and now we were both on the verge of sleeping, so we didn't overreact at first. Maybe it was just a neighbor. I mean, it could have been a bird hitting the house or something. And just as we convinced ourselves it was nothing to worry about, the knocks at the door started, almost in a perfect rhythm. The bangs on the door echoed throughout the house. We had no idea at that moment what to do. This was clearly not a neighbor. This was real life, and there was someone knocking on the door at 2 a.m. Every couple of seconds, the knocks would come again. Sometimes they were harder, and sometimes they were light knocks. It didn't matter what type of knock it was, just the thought that someone was standing out there at this hour was enough to scare us out of our wits. We both snuck over to one of the windows so we could catch a glimpse of the knocking person. It was just a normal-looking man. We saw he didn't look like some addict, a criminal, or even just really sketchy. He literally looked completely normal. He was wearing what seemed to be a nice pair of sneakers, jeans, and had a nice Nike polo shirt on that you might even wear for golfing. His hair was short and neatly groomed, and he was clean-shaven. Not exactly a scary individual, but still just so weird and so unsettling given the time. We both looked at each other in confusion, trying to process what was happening and trying to think of the correct way to handle this. And then he started to bang on the door again, and we jumped down. Remember, this is 2 a.m, so this could have been a Girl Scout selling cookies, and it would have been unsettling. I was watching out the window while my friend was trying to call his parents. He was unsuccessful, but he kept trying. He wasn't smart enough to call the hotel or wherever they were staying. The guy finally just walked away, but the relief was short-lived. Maybe 30 seconds later, he returned and taped a note on the front door. He didn't knock this time or anything, just left that note. He sat on the front steps for almost 5 minutes and then walked away. I kept looking outside, but I couldn't see him, and we both decided that whoever this character was, he had to have been gone by now. My friend went to unlock the door, and I yelled at him to stop. He told me the guy was gone and that I had nothing to worry about anymore. He wanted to know what the note said, and I'm not going to lie, I wanted to know what it said as well. My friend opened the door and grabbed the note, and as he was pulling the tape off the door, we heard a loud bellowing voice from the distance, "Hey, you." And we both froze and looked up. The knocking man came out of the bushes from across the street and started to charge at the door. We both screamed as we were shutting the door, and another large man came out of the bushes and followed the man from earlier. My buddy slammed the door and was fortunate enough to get it locked before they reached the door. Both men started to pound on that door, not knocking, pounding. I looked out the window, and I saw the larger man, who wasn't up there originally, slamming his shoulder into the door. The bangs on the door were unrelenting, and we started to fear the worst. Finally, my friend called the police, and the guys outside must have heard what we were saying because they fled instantly. The police showed up and thankfully were able to get a hold of my friend's parents, and they came home immediately. The worst part about all of this was the note that had been taped to the door. It was a very violent and detailed note about being at the house to pick up the money. I remember it saying things like no more running around, no more excuses, and a bunch of other things like that. The note was signed with some name like Leroy. His dad denied everything and claimed and swore up and down that he had no idea who this Leroy was and what money he was talking about. I remember it being very weird and very uncomfortable around this family for a while until it was all sort of forgotten about. My friend and I never forgot about that night, though, and we still talk about it to this day. I wondered to myself all the time if his dad was secretly up to something. I mean, the note addressed him specifically by name. They knew where he lived. And then after that night, nothing ever happened again. It just all seems so weird, but I guess I don't know enough about the seedy underbelly of society to know if this is normal or not. We never got any more closure on that night, and trust me, I tried. One night, we pestered his dad for an hour trying to get information, and he just kind of rolled his eyes, saying that it just must have been some weirdo playing a prank. Maybe, and whatever it was a horrible night and a horrible memory that I'll always remember. And to this day, I still don't like being home. I think the word toxic is actually toxic, and we throw the word around like it's some sort of frisbee. One topic that has always got brought up in that toxic conversation is toxic exes. Oh, how exes are terrible. Not all exes are bad, though, but the ones that are, I think, truly encompass the word toxic. You see, I was engaged a few years ago, and it ended very poorly. My fiancée got a job about 100 miles from her hometown, so I moved with her and started a life here. I didn't have friends or family or anyone to turn to when we broke up, and because of the job I started, I decided not to head home just yet. It's not important how things ended, but they did end very poorly. She begged for me back, but I couldn't put myself through that heartache again. Right after the breakup, she kept the house, and I found a small one-bedroom apartment. I just hoped that I would be able to meet some new friends, which I am really bad at, by the way. A few weeks after the breakup, I was just sitting in the apartment, sulking, which was my favorite hobby around that time. The apartment was on the first floor of the building, which was really like the half basement, if that makes sense. My windows were at level 1. It was just my head that was above ground. The rest of the apartment was below the ground. I had a lovely view of nothing to help me cope with my crippling depression at the time. One night, while I was just sort of being a bum, the power went out. We were having a pretty bad storm, and the last time we had a storm like this, the power was out for several hours. I knew I couldn't just sit in silence, and since it was getting late, I couldn't really go anywhere anyway, even though I probably wouldn't have if I could. I lit a few candles that I had and sat at my table. It was a small table that only fit 2 chairs. I loved to draw and color in high school, and I had some talent before I gave it up. This was the perfect chance for me to draw and just sort of get lost in something that I used to love so much. While I was drawing, trying to get my mind off of my ex, I heard something. It was a loud noise, and it sounded pretty close. Unfortunately, it was too dark to see anywhere in my apartment other than the little area that I was sitting in with the candles. I slowly walked over to where I heard the noise, and lying at my window outside was what looked like some sort of figure. I jumped back because I was scared, even though I knew this had to be crazy. No one would break into this apartment. They would have to get on their stomach and practically crawl into the apartment. Not to mention, hardly anyone in this town knows even who I am. I went back to the small table, blew the candles out. This way I could use the darkness to my advantage and be able to see out the window better. I didn't know for sure what I saw at this point, and it's possible that it could have been nothing. It could have even been a skunk or something trying to get out of the storm. I just didn't know. I went back over to the window, and I could see it clearly now. This was no animal, and this was not my imagination. Lying on the ground, trying to open the window, was a person dressed in all dark clothes. I freaked out. I didn't know what to do. The obvious answer was to call the police or the authorities or whoever, but I don't know why, in the heat of the moment, that just didn't cross my mind. The only person I really knew was my ex-fiancée, and I decided to give in to my fear and loneliness and call her for help. Right as I pressed call, a light could be seen shining through the window, and a brief melody of a ringtone could be heard. The call went right to voicemail after that, I guess, and knowing what was most likely happening, I decided to call right back to see if it was a coincidence. And sure enough, the light and ringtone went off for a split second before the intruder shut it off. My ex was trying to break into my apartment. The why, at this hour, in this weather, her intentions were clearly sinister. I started to yell, and she kept trying to break in through the window, but thankfully, it remained locked. I called the police, and as soon as she heard me on the phone, I saw her get up and run off. I told the cops everything when they arrived. They actually didn't believe me right away, and they looked almost annoyed, like I was bothering them with this. But when they looked out the window, they could see the spot in the dirt where someone was lying, and there were clearly signs of forced entry. They finally agreed to follow up and see where my ex was. When the cops went and questioned her, she seemed to deny everything, which didn't surprise me. She said that she had been with her new boyfriend and that I needed to move on. This guy also vouched for her and said that she was at the house the entire night with him. Either this guy was in on it or she was already manipulating him. I called her out for being a liar, and I was the one who was branded a liar and a crazy ex. At the end of it, when I brought up that I called her twice and both times the phone lit up, she said that her phone was broken, so it couldn't have been her. And this was it for me. I couldn't live in this town anymore, and now that I didn't feel safe being here either. I paid an early termination fee for my lease, and I moved home to stay with my family until I got back on my feet. I've never heard from her again, and I'm so thankful for that. My life is much better without that toxic human ruining my life. I was born and raised in the Catholic Church. I believe in God. I believe in the devil. I believe in good and evil. I believe in an essential order to the universe, one that can be occasionally cruel, but one that makes sense in the grand scheme of things. I'm also an amateur astronomer. Some people say those two things don't really go together, but no matter how much I search for the heavens, I'll only ever be looking at the stars. But to me, that's besides the point. I don't believe that my faith precludes me from appreciating some of God's finer works. And believe it or not, there's no denying that the night sky is one of the Lord's more incredible creations. That being said, I once witnessed something that, to me, made absolutely zero sense. It didn't shake my faith, and in fact, I feel like it's even stronger as a result. It's something that neither myself nor anyone else has ever been able to successfully explain. So, imagine you're me for a second. You've got your telescope set up in your backyard. You have a hot cocoa on hand. It's one of those perfect silent, cloudless winter nights, one almost tailor-made for amateur astronomers such as yourself. You're checking off your favorite constellations, nodding hello to the bovine face of Pleiades, counting all 4 of Jupiter's bright Galilean moons when suddenly your lens goes black. At first, you kind of jump back from the telescope because your lens only normally goes dark if something is in the way of the scope. You're relieved to see that no one's there, as a strange person slightly manifesting in front of your scope in the middle of the night would be a whole mess of trouble. But then you're kind of worried because your $3,000 telescope is out of warranty, and you can't exactly take those things down to Walmart to get them repaired. But then something compels you to look up, and that's when you realize that the entire night sky, moon and all, has gone completely dark. At first, I know this might sound like a terrible cliche, but I actually thought I was either dreaming or seeing things. I remember blinking hard, the way you do when you're dreaming as a kid and you're trying to wake yourself up from a bad dream. But when I opened my eyes and looked through the sky again, I realized I wasn't just imagining the whole thing. The sky had gone from its regular celestial glory to a ceiling painted matte black. Suddenly, I realized I must have been witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime astronomical event, a kind of celestial eclipse, the likes of which would be talked about and dissected for generations to come. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, while this great electric tingle went through me. I thought about trying to capture the event on my phone, and as much as I wanted to, I found that I just couldn't move. It was pure hesitation, half of thinking it'll just be a blank black picture, and then I figured I could make a video of the stars flickering back on. But that's when a very, very frightening series of thoughts occurred to me, the first being, what if they don't flicker back on? What if it's not some kind of mass heavy cloud cover? And what if it was? Surely, I'd be able to see the ambient light from the moon lighting up the clouds. And that's when this feeling of intense panic started to rise up inside me. I appreciate this might sound a little melodramatic, but I began to wonder if I was witnessing something less wondrous and more apocalyptic. As those thoughts and feelings began to take hold, I was suddenly gripped by the desire to run back into my house and wake my wife. I didn't know what was about to happen, but whatever it was, if it was bad, I didn't want her to be taken by surprise by it. And as I tried to move, I couldn't unglue my gaze from the darkened skies above. That's when I saw it. I can only describe it as the entire sky shifting, like I was looking at nothing but a jet black canopy that suddenly and violently shifted before my eyes. I know that sounds illogical, like how could I know it was moving if there was nothing but pitch black up there? But trust me, my brain registered the movement so much so that I felt almost dizzy from it. It was like a black wing moved over the earth, and right as it passed over us, I saw the heavens light up again. Every single star in the sky, including the moon, flickered back to life in an instant. That feeling of vertigo hit me even harder than before. I stumbled backward, falling on my butt, like a toddler who was still learning to walk. Then, once I'd picked myself up, a singular thought occurred to me: check the internet, check the news. I remember running to my desktop, bringing up a browser window, then checking every single news website I could think of. I expected to see headlines consisting of things like breaking news, starlight blackout shakes America, or what just happened in the skies over North America. But there was nothing, just ads for blackout curtains or Quora questions about when the sun is going to burn out. In frustration, I called an astronomer friend of mine that lived up in Maine. As soon as he answered the phone, I knew he'd be no help. They sounded groggy, like I'd just woken him up, and as it turned out, that was exactly the case. And just in case, I asked him if he'd been watching the skies over the past hour or so. But it was no surprise when he said no. They must have been able to hear the tension in my voice, however, because he quickly started asking what was wrong. That's when I launched into this long diatribe regarding what I just saw. Admittedly, I was a mess of what I'd seen, my ideas on it, the prospect of it being a world-shaking event. It shouldn't have surprised me that he'd interrupt to tell me, "Steve, call me back in the morning, man. I'm too tired for this right now." But it did. It hurt a little having such a close friend and fellow astronomer disbelieve me, but at the same time, I understood why he was so skeptical. I suppose that was what the likes of Galileo felt, discovering the world was round, but having everyone think he was nuts. I checked the news again in the morning, found nothing, then immediately called my friend up in Maine. I told him the same story down to the last detail. But when I was done, he said something that nailed shut the coffin lid of my story. "Steve, I think you should go see a doctor." That was the last time I told anyone what I'd experienced. Even my wife doesn't know what happened to me that night. I still search online from time to time, looking for any trace of newspaper articles. historical accounts or eyewitness reports of what I'd come to call the blackout. But still, there was nothing, no matter how hard I looked. There were no historical accounts which matched up to what I'd seen that night. Eventually, I just dropped it, and I tried to get on with my life without dangerously obsessing over the blackout. I didn't want to think that I was crazy, and I did take my friend's words to heart. I kept on skygazing, but told myself that if any repeated incidents occurred, I'd go straight to a doctor to tell them what I was experiencing. But it didn't happen again. I suppose I should have done the same a long time ago, created a kind of marker stone for anyone who might experience or witness the same thing. But I didn't, and that's what I suppose I'm trying to correct by typing this all up. I still don't know what happened that night. I still don't know what I was looking at or what moved across the sky that practically knocked me on my butt. But I think the only thing that stopped me from going crazy is the strength of my faith in God. I think I saw the hand of my Creator that night, or at least that's what I choose to believe, because the alternative, any alternative, is almost too terrifying to consider.
I'm an icon, man. I'm a girl about a 10. I should fuck her in a